Hello everyone, and I hope you're having a wonderful day. Today, we'll discover why Hugh suddenly returns Ngo Tue's custody decision and how one warning about his Japan records reveals that someone may already know exactly what evidence could decide the fate of his home. If you enjoy the story, don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss our next videos. Morning came quietly after a night of mountain rain, with thin mist resting over the bamboo fence and wet vegetable beds. Before making breakfast, he stepped outside with Lou and went directly toward the gate they had recently finished together. He pressed every post, tested the latch, pulled the chain, and examined the small lock for scratches or unfamiliar marks. Nothing appeared broken, but he still crouched and studied the red mud beneath the lowest bamboo rail for fresh footprints. Danger rarely entered openly anymore, because it arrived as cigarette butts, wet notes, official envelopes, and people watching from trees. After one final look toward the trees, Ngo Tue returned to the garden and carried his woven gui between bean rows. The yard-long beans were ready, hanging in green clusters beneath leaves still heavy with moisture from the previous night's rain. Ngo Tue began harvesting steadily, because ordinary work remained the easiest way to calm thoughts about documents, threats, and family. Plants never asked who signed an old boundary paper or where his money from Japan had gone during years abroad. By the time Cham woke, the basket was already filling with long green beans shining beneath the pale mountain light. She appeared behind the repaired glass doors with tangled hair, asking why her father had started working without his partner. She asked whether Ngo Tue still planned to walk toward the market when the ridge already looked dark with rain. Ngo Tue looked at the basket and answered that ripe beans would not wait simply because mountain weather had changed. After breakfast, he asked a trusted elderly neighbor to stay near Cham until it was time for school. Before he left, Cham held her blue school bag and asked whether Ngo Tue would return before the final bell. The question remained painfully familiar, because too many adults had disappeared from Cham's life after making promises they could not keep. Ngo Tue adjusted her worn school bag strap, looked directly at her, and promised that he would come back that afternoon. He secured the bamboo gate and started down the narrow mountain path with the heavy gui balanced across his back. Halfway to the market, rain struck suddenly and turned the red dirt road into slippery mud within only minutes. Ngo Tue hurried beneath a low roadside eave, lowered the basket, and checked whether the fresh beans had been damaged. A motorbike passed through the rain without slowing, and its rider kept a dark hood pulled low across his face. When the rain weakened, he continued toward the lower market, where vendors still worked beneath patched roofs and plastic sheets. At the market, the beans sold quickly, but one buyer asked whether they came from the newly fenced hillside house. Ngo Tue's hand stopped over the scale, and he asked why she wanted to know something so specific about his home. The woman shrugged and said people at the market talked, then accepted her change without giving him another explanation. When the final beans were sold, Ngo Tue left earlier than planned and bought 1 kilogram of carrots for the rabbits. On the way home, the rain stopped almost suddenly, while weak sunlight returned through broken clouds above the mountain. Near the stream, Ngo Tue left the main path and searched beneath several bamboo clumps for young shoots for dinner. He found only a modest amount, then sat beside the water and peeled away their tough outer layers. He considered buying more notebooks and a stronger school bag before heavier rain finally destroyed the worn straps she kept defending. When he reached the hillside, the bamboo gate stood exactly where he had left it earlier that morning. Ngo Tue offered the carrots to May, Dat, and Geo, but all 3 rabbits sniffed briefly before turning away. He complained that he had carried those carrots through mountain rain for nothing, when soft laughter suddenly sounded behind him. Ngo Tue turned sharply and saw Hugh standing outside the locked gate, alone beneath the pale afternoon light. She carried no umbrella or thick folder, only one folded paper protected carefully inside a transparent plastic sleeve. After checking the road and nearby trees, Ngo Tue unlocked the gate and asked why Hugh had returned without warning. Hugh looked toward the repaired house and said she had come to return something that should remain with Ngo Tue. Hugh placed the protected paper on the wooden table beside the carrots and the bamboo shoots prepared for dinner. Ngo Tue recognized the court stamp immediately and understood that she had brought back the official custody decision for Cham. Hugh admitted she had asked Ngo Tue's mother for the document weeks earlier, when she still hoped to challenge him. At that time, Hugh believed she might use the paper and the instability around the hillside to take Cham away. Hugh pushed it toward him and said quietly that she had not come that afternoon to take Cham anywhere. A dry branch snapped somewhere below the bamboo trees, making Ngo Tue immediately lift his eyes toward the lower slope. Hugh asked whether someone was there, and Ngo Tue answered that it was probably an animal moving through wet bamboo. Hugh said she had watched Cham from a distance several times, although she never entered the yard or approached her. According to villagers, Cham laughed more, attended school without crying, and no longer flinched whenever adults suddenly raised their voices. Hugh admitted that when Ngo Tue first returned, she expected him to fail as a father on the hillside. She thought he was angry, poor, unprepared, and unable to raise a frightened child inside such a damaged house. First came the roof, then a bed, desk, bathroom, stronger doors, vegetable beds, animal shelters, and finally the gate. Hugh said the greatest change was not the house itself, because the most important change had happened inside Cham. Ngo Tue sat across from her and asked why she took the custody decision if she now understood that truth. Hugh admitted she had still wanted to win and once hoped the threats around the property would weaken Ngo Tue's case. She believed dangerous visitors, disputed land, and repeated conflict might help prove that Cham should live somewhere else. Ngo Tue's jaw tightened when he understood Hugh had once considered using danger around his home against his custody. She now understood Ngo Tue was not fighting adults to prove pride, because he was fighting to keep Cham safe. Hugh also understood Cham had been fighting quietly by repeating the same answer whenever adults asked where she belonged. Every time they asked, Cham said she wanted to remain with Ngo Tue inside the home they had rebuilt. Then Hugh pushed the decision closer and said she would no longer challenge Ngo Tue's legal custody of Cham. Ngo Tue had imagined hearing those words many times, yet relief did not arrive as quickly as he expected. Suspicion came first, because land documents, Japan payments, missing records, lens warnings, and unknown watchers were becoming dangerously connected. He asked why Hugh had changed her position now, just as official pressure around the hillside was becoming stronger. She admitted she did not know everything, but knew another custody fight would only force Cham through more fear. Ngo Tue asked whether Hugh's decision had anything to do with the disputed land or the records from Japan. Hugh hesitated for one brief moment, and that hesitation told Ngo Tue more than any quick denial could have. She insisted she came only about Cham, then admitted people were pressuring her through papers, arguments, and demands to choose sides. Ngo Tue's attention sharpened, and he asked who had been pressuring Hugh to choose a side in the conflict. Before she answered, Liu suddenly raised his head and growled toward the bamboo fence, stopping both adults immediately. The lower slope appeared empty, but a thin gray line of cigarette smoke briefly rose above the wet leaves. Ngo Tue stepped closer and called toward the trees, asking who was standing there, yet nobody answered from below. Hugh became visibly pale and told Ngo Tue that he should keep the gate locked from that moment forward. Ngo Tue turned toward her and said she clearly knew something about the people who had been watching his home. She picked up her bag, glanced toward the road, and mentioned that people were discussing another official land meeting. Ngo Tue stared at her because no official had informed him that another meeting had already been scheduled. He asked how Hugh knew, and she immediately realized she had revealed something she had not intended to mention. Hugh claimed Ngo Tue's mother had spoken about it, but refused to explain when or how she heard. Ngo Tue stepped into her path and asked whether somebody was watching the house specifically because of important documents. Fear crossed Hugh's face, and she warned that valuable papers should not remain where people expected them to be. Ngo Tue asked which papers she meant, and Hugh looked at him for several long seconds before answering. "The ones from Japan," Hugh said quietly, then opened the gate and walked downhill before Ngo Tue could stop her. Ngo Tue remained completely still because he had never told Hugh where the original Japan remittance records were stored. He watched until she disappeared around the bend, then returned to the custody decision with growing unease. The document should have meant one painful battle was ending, yet Hugh's final warning had opened another dangerous question. Ngo Tue carried the decision inside and placed it beside Cham's school records inside the wooden document box. Then he checked every original Japan remittance receipt, counted them carefully once, and repeated the count a second time. Nothing was missing, but Hugh's knowledge made the familiar wooden box suddenly feel far too obvious and vulnerable. Ngo Tue wrapped the originals separately and hid them beneath a loose wooden board behind Cham's handmade desk. He left only copies inside the box, then returned it to the highest shelf before preparing to collect Cham. The afternoon bell was approaching, and whatever else was happening, Ngo Tue had promised to meet his daughter after school. He hurried downhill while sunlight stretched across the wet path, reaching the school before Cham had waited very long. Cham's face brightened when she saw him, and she said simply that her father had really come back. Ngo Tue lifted her bag onto his shoulder and reminded her that he had already promised he would return. On the walk home, Cham described reading practice, a forgotten pencil, and preparations for the approaching new school year. She asked about notebooks, then quickly said her old school bag could survive if they repaired both worn straps again. Ngo Tue smiled because Cham had learned too young to make every personal need sound smaller than it really was. He told her the beans were partly for school supplies and promised they would inspect the old bag together. At home, Cham noticed the carrots and hurried toward the rabbits, only to watch May refuse the first piece. Dad and Ngo rejected them too, making Cham laugh when Ngo Tue complained about carrying unwanted carrots through heavy rain. For several precious moments, her laughter made Hugh's warning, the hidden documents and the cigarette smoke, feel far away. Father and daughter prepared the bamboo shoots together, boiling them in 2 batches because their small pot could not hold everything. While Cham arranged the sliced pieces for drying, she asked whether anyone had visited during her school day. Ngo Tue told her Hugh had come, and Cham immediately asked whether another argument had happened near their gate. He explained that Hugh returned the custody decision and said she would no longer fight to take Cham away. Cham did not smile immediately because adults had changed too many promises for easy trust to return overnight. She looked around their hillside home and asked whether that meant she could finally stay there without another fight. Ngo Tue reminded her that the court decision already said she would remain with him under his legal care. Cham searched his face and asked whether nobody could arrive tomorrow with another paper and suddenly change everything. Ngo Tue refused to promise what he could not control, especially while other adults and official documents remained involved. Instead, he covered her hand and promised that tomorrow, whatever happened, he would still remain her father. Cham considered the smaller promise, then nodded because honest uncertainty felt safer than another comforting promise that might break. They finished dinner while Lou slept near the doorway and the rabbits continued ignoring Ngo Tue's carefully purchased carrots. Cham divided their food equally and talked about school until the small room slowly began feeling ordinary again. Ngo Tue listened carefully, remembering these simple conversations were exactly the life he had worked years to protect. Before sleeping, Cham checked whether the gate was locked and asked if Ngo Tue would remain close enough to hear her. He showed her the key beside the lamp and promised he was staying, allowing Cham to relax behind the curtain. After her breathing became slow, Ngo Tue stepped outside alone and checked the chain, latch, and surrounding darkness again. For several minutes, nothing moved until a tiny orange light appeared between the trees below their bamboo fence. Ngo Tue recognized the glowing end of a cigarette before it disappeared briefly behind one of the dark trunks. The light appeared again farther downhill, suggesting somebody was walking away or deliberately pretending to leave the property. Ngo Tue refused to follow because Cham was sleeping behind him, and leaving would surrender the safety he still controlled. He watched until the orange glow vanished completely, while the lower mountain returned to darkness and deliberate silence. From inside the house, Cham softly called for her father without fully waking from her sleep. Ngo Tue kept his eyes on the trees and answered immediately that he was there and had gone nowhere. He returned inside, locked the repaired glass doors, and checked the hidden Japan records behind Cham's desk once more. The original receipts remained safe, exactly where he had moved them after Hugh's unexpected and frightening warning. Ngo Tue looked toward the returned custody decision resting beside Cham's other official papers on the high shelf. One battle seemed closer to ending, but someone outside already knew exactly which evidence could decide the next one. No engine started and no footsteps reached the gate, yet Ngo Tue no longer mistook mountain silence for safety. He lowered the lamp, listened to Cham breathing peacefully, and understood that somebody beyond the fence was still watching. Ngo Tue begins the day harvesting yard-long beans and selling them at the market, trying to earn money for Cham's school needs. After returning home, he is surprised when Hugh arrives with the official custody decision and admits she will no longer fight to take Cham away. However, her visit brings a disturbing warning. Hugh reveals that people are discussing another land meeting and somehow knows that Ngo Tue's original Japan remittance records are important. Realizing someone may be watching both his home and the evidence, Ngo Tue secretly moves the original documents to a safer hiding place. Later, he collects Cham from school and tells her that Hugh has stepped back from the custody battle. Their peaceful evening is shattered when Ngo Tue spots the glow of a cigarette beyond the bamboo fence, confirming that someone may still be watching their home from the darkness.